Well, I've always felt that for every wrong there should be some kind of a remedy. And I think
Federal Court Judge Theodore McMillian, who passed away in January, just short of his 87th birthday, was a leader. Not a leader of organizations or protests or marches. He was a leader in the sense that often in his life, he went first. His accomplishments were many and impressive, especially in light of the obstacles and the indignities. Even as a judge, he would be refused service in restaurants. That was the world and the community he was born into, and that he helped change.
I've often wondered, as much as I was able to achieve now, I just wonder if I had been in that type of society that was just colorblind, if I had been able to go to some of the better schools like Harvard or Yale, could I have achieved and done more? Not only for myself, but just for people in general.
Ted McMillian was born with a brilliant mind and dark skin. And in St. Louis in 1919, it was his skin color that said where he could live, go to school, what he could and could not do. But he fought on and would himself sit in judgment, deciding what could and could not be in America. Ted McMillian's mind was not wasted, but time and time and time again, he would be tested.
You had to encounter prejudice, you had to encounter attitudes that have changed, and he changed so many attitudes.
McMillian's family, like so many others in St. Louis in the early part of this century, had come north in the great Mississippi migration to a city where African Americans were still segregated, but where they could vote and send their children to school, and they could find work. His grandfather had a mule team and dug basements for new homes. His grandmother took in boarders, new arrivals from the South, and made and sold lunches at work sites around the city. It was she who raised young Ted.
This house we lived in on 2600 on Lucas, we had a regular coal stove and it had a warmer. And she would get up early in the morning and she would always fix my little breakfast and put it warm. And when I'd wake up about 7:30, I could get my breakfast and get out of there and go to school. You had to go to school in her house.
Even early in his life, Ted McMillian seemed to be close to history. Josephine Baker was his babysitter. And in grade school, the tornado of 1927 sent a telephone pole crashing into his classroom. Worried about his new puppies, he ran home. They, too, were survivors.
Ran up Leonard, came over Easton, down to Webster, and ran up on the 3rd floor. Rushed out on the roof to see about my dogs. And Lord had a way of taking care of them.
Ted McMillian graduated from Vashon High School in 3 years, first in his class. At Lincoln University, he majored in physics and math, and was headed to the University of Chicago to become a physicist when the war came. He was in the Signal Corps of the 1st Army, and Lieutenant McMillian directed traffic across the Remagen Bridge, sending American tanks and trucks into the heart of Germany. But in the Army, he always had an asterisk by his name, denoting his race and the limits of what he would be allowed to do and how much responsibility he could be given. As America battled racist regimes, its own Army and Navy remained segregated. It was one thing for a boy like Ted McMillian to grow up in segregated neighborhoods and schools in St. Louis. It was another for the man in a U.S. Army lieutenant's uniform to be forced to change to a blacks-only car when his train crossed into Arkansas.
I didn't really think that anything was going to change until after I'd been into the Army and the war, and I just figured then at that time that if we could fight for the country, then we should have a right to come back, and that things would at least ameliorate and change to somewhat. I didn't know how great the change would be, but I thought that there would be some changes.
During the war, St. Louis University opened its doors to its first black students. And when Army veteran Ted McMillian saw the waiting list for medical school, he went into law. And now, for one of the first times in his life, he was able to compete on a level playing field. Ted McMillian graduated in 1949, first in his law school class. But that still wasn't enough to get a black man into one of the top downtown law firms.
I always have thought you can't waste your time being angry over things like that, because there are other avenues and other doors, and you have to try them and try to have yourself prepared if the opportunity ever presents itself where you can go ahead.
And another door did open. He was hired by Circuit Attorney Edward Dowd Sr. as the city's first black prosecutor, and Dowd got his money's worth.
Yeah, that's right. He worked as hard as he's ever worked in his life when he was with me, because we only had so many assistants, and this big docket of murder first, murder second, manslaughter, and Ted had a big part of that docket, and he handled it without any great strain.
Ted McMillian continued to break new ground. He was named the state's first African-American judge in 1956. He was named to the State Appeals Court in '72 and the U.S. Court of Appeals in 1978.
There may be judges as good as him, but there's none any better. And the amazing thing about Ted, though, is not so much what he's accomplished since he's become a judge. Most people know that. It's what he accomplished even before, that he persisted in going forward under adverse circumstances.
You've participated in so many firsts. You've been the first this and first that. Was it ever lonely doing that all the time? Did you ever resent being first constantly?
I didn't resent being first, but at some time it left a lonely place for you. You didn't have anyone of your background and your color that you could actually talk to or talk with or to discuss. But the one thing that I can say that most of the colleagues that I've had over the years, they've been very open, they've been very helpful. I never will forget, in 1957, I attended my first judicial conference, and at that time we were in Springfield. And when I got ready to go into the dining room, I was stopped at the door. It said blacks couldn't come in. And the Supreme Court judges at that particular time, Judge Hollingsworth and all of the rest of them, Leedy, they just lifted the whole program out of the Kentworth Arms Hotel, and I don't think they went back up to about 23 years later, and they carried us over there to the old...
Judge McMillian was known for his support of civil liberties and for his work in the community. The Human Development Corporation, Legal Services of Eastern Missouri, the Herbert Hoover Boys Club, and the Urban League. He grew up in a world where segregation and discrimination were enforced by tradition and by law. Ted McMillian faced the odds and he beat them. And he opened doors through which others would follow.
I think his whole career, as well as his entire life, has been characterized by three things: intelligence, integrity, and courage. And I think he brings those values and that kind of commitment to everything he does. And to me, he set the bar by how a public person should be measured and how they ought to try to do their job and the contributions they ought to try to make.
And I thought it out, and I thought that if I could write my own epitaph, I would like for it to say this, or to be looked upon in this way, not for what I've accomplished, not for any material thing that I have gathered, but I'd like to be remembered as to how many times I was able to look back over my shoulder and to give a helping hand to someone who's behind me, so as to pull him and her up so that they too can share in what you call this American dream.